Warmest greetings, sisters and brothers.
The struggle is...
And welcome to the Pan-African People's Phone-In. The Pan-African People's Phone-In is a space for themed interactive discussions conducted in cyberspace. The issues covered, whether historical or contemporary, impact African people both locally and globally. Pan-African People's Phone-In will from time to time include guests. We're at the beginning phase now, so we won't have guests specifically within the program. But occasionally some of those guests will be non-African guests who will be invited to come in and contribute their ideas. Now, the activities of all guests will be examined on the basis of their relevance to African people. Interviews and presentations will set the scene for a more general discussion in the second half of the program, where listeners will be invited to phone in, ask questions, and contribute. We ask that you spread the word. Please tell all of your family, friends, fellow organisation members, colleagues, associates, and other networks about the show. Message your friends right now. Let them know that the program is happening. Encourage them to listen every Monday from 8 p.m. until 10 p.m. Let me say greetings to all of the people that take time to be with us, at this time on a Monday evening here on Bless Radio. Of course, that includes all of the listeners. It includes all of the aspiring listeners. Greetings to you. Good evening to you. It includes the engineers who behind the scenes are working away to ensure that this facility is available to us. Good evening to you. It includes the management who create and maintain the infrastructure that allows us to communicate and share information in this way. And of course it also includes my fellow presenters. So good evening to the management, good evening to my fellow presenters. Together we create a structure of programming which we hope is something that you'll find useful in your lives. Now, let me start from the very top. Let me just give out a number in case anybody feels they want to ring in at some point during the program. The number for interaction is 07 9 444 313 66. That's 079 444 313 66. I usually say at this time, take a bit of time, or give you a little bit of time to see if you can get paper and pen, etc., or whatever means you have for recording or documenting the number. So I'll say it once more in a little while again, just in case people need that time to, gather their recording instruments, whatever they are, whether it's pen and paper or something more sophisticated. So the number for interaction in this evening's program is 079 444 313 66. Now, in this evening's program, we're going to continue with our study of Marcus Garvey, and I think what I'll do is I'll give an overview, a quick overview of the book that it's coming from, Pan-Africanism, from Program to Philosophy, an outlook on liberation. And the overview reads as follows. Pan-Africanism from Program to Philosophy is the only book in the world to provide clear, lucid and simple explanations of the liberation strategies of Marcus Garvey, Kwame Nkrumah and Malcolm X. Historians have been naturally concerned with reporting the facts of the lives of these great Pan-Africanists, but it is for activists to contextualize them in liberation strategies and action plans, a process kick-started in it. In addition, it provides a clear, succinct explanation of international capitalism's parasitical dependence upon African people. It provides clear, simple explanation of scientific socialism, relating it to African principles and culture. It introduces the notion of the greater cycle of revolution, which examines and locates revolution not as an incident, but as a process in the context of the entirety of human history. Through an examination of universal principles, it locates the material base of two opposing sets of ideologies driving humanity and identifies the natural position of African culture in that milieu. And finally, and fifthly, through a newly devised set of dialectical tools, it provides a powerfully clear philosophical analysis of matter as a basis for uncovering and understanding universal laws required for Africa's liberation. Pan-Africanism from Program to Philosophy is a long overdue, much needed source book on the theory of Pan-Africanism. For people new to Pan-Africanist activity, or those simply wanting to understand what Pan-Africanism is, this book provides clear theoretical guidance. For seasoned cadres and veterans of the Pan-African movement, it is a checkpoint, a frame of reference for assessing, orientating, even refocusing the trajectory of their activity. Ideally, it should be studied collectively in groups, particularly those genuinely working towards the liberation of Africa and her people in the context of worldwide revolution. We've been looking at this book now for a few weeks. We've gone through chapter 1, which is a kind of introductory overview to Pan-Africanism. And for the last couple of weeks or so, we've been looking at one of the giants of Pan-Africanism, Marcus Garvey. And we've been looking at the strategy of Marcus Garvey, which is chapter 2 in this book. We looked at Garvey's ideas on organisation. And we looked last week at Garvey's and the UNIA's approach to working with other groups, working with non-African groups. groups to get a sense of the kind of ideas that were driving Garvey and the UNIA. This week, we will be looking at the area of repatriation. Repatriation, which is such an important area in the history as it relates to Marcus Garvey and the UNIA. Some people actually believe that that's what the UNIA was about. That's not correct as an interpretation, but it plays, it was such a significant part of the UNIA that some people actually thought that that was the purpose of the UNIA. But we'll try to contextualize that in today's program as we continue to look at the strategy of Marcus Garvey. Now, before we do that, what we will do is we will go into the libation corner. So if you just bear with me one moment, we will go into the libation corner. Libation corner The Libation Corner is a section of the program where we honor our ancestors and the historical liberation achievements of our ancestors. Now, you can contribute to the Libation Corner in one of three ways. Firstly, if you have a loved one that has recently passed, you're invited to ring in and have that loved one acknowledged during the Libation Corner. Secondly, if it is the anniversary of the passing of a loved one, then again, you are invited to ring in and have that loved one acknowledged during the Libation Corner. And thirdly, if there's an African historical anniversary that all of us should be remembering at this time, then once again, we ask that you ring in and share that African historical anniversary with us. Now, what I do in the Libation Corner is I share some African historical anniversaries briefly. And if you decide that you want to ring in and share something more personal to you, all you do is you just make that call. The number is 07944 31366. You just make that call, and all that will happen is that I will stop, allow you to make your contribution, and then after you've completed, then I will resume the libations that I'm sharing. So, today is the 6th of January 2020, first program of the new year. So happy new year to everybody, those that are listening, those that may not quite have got round to listening yet but maybe will join us later. Happy new year to you also. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to share some libations for some of our inventors, actually. And beginning with the 7th. That is the 7th of January. And we go back to the year 1890. On the 7th of January 1890, one of our ancestors, by the name of W.B. Purvis, patented the fountain pen. Now, can you imagine that? That we were instrumental in inventing the fountain pen. So, W.B. Purvis gains the credit for that. Moving on to the 9th. The 9th of January, and this time we go back to the year 1872. That's even earlier. And one of our ancestors by the name of T. Elkins patents the chamber commode. Any of us who have had to look after our elderly people, will know how important something like a commode actually is. And it's interesting that should be patented by an African person, but because of the kind of caring role that we were put into during the enslavement era, it makes sense actually that it would be an African person to create or design or invent a commode. Now, moving on to the 8th of January, and we go back again to the same kind of period, to 1811. Because on the 8th of January 1811, Charles Deslandes led enslaved African people in an uprising, a revolt against slavery in New Orleans. Now, 1811 is an interesting time because that was the period of transition. That was the period where France, or the French imperialism that is, was selling New Orleans to the Europeans in USA. So it was at that point, around that point in history, that all of that was going on, and in between the uncertainty, African people saw an opportunity to rise up and claim their freedom. The leader of that particular revolt, we remember his name, Charles Deslandes. And as we move on to the 10th of January, going back to the year 1888, one of our ancestors by the name of A.B. Blackburn patented the railway signal. We're thankful to the people that do this research, because it gives us a sense of the extent of the genius of African people and the contributions made by African people. So, we were the ones that made sure the trains didn't crash. And so our ancestor A.B. Blackburn patented the railway signal. And the final contribution that I'll be making to the Libation Corner in this evening's programme goes back to the year 1886. And in 1886, L.H. Latimer, some of you will remember Latimer, very famous African inventor who is credited with, I believe it was the light bulb. Was one of the things that he invented. Was it light bulb or the traffic lights? Yeah, the traffic lights was another of the things that he patented. Well, Latimer patented the apparatus for cooling and disinfecting. So he was a real scientist, an ingenious scientist who invented across the board. So remember our ancestor L.H. Latimer. Sitting in my lonely room, feeling nothing but doom and I've
gonna die, baby. Oh Lord, because ever since the day you left, I don't know what to do with myself. All on my hands and knees, wishing for your return. And oh, how I hurt, and I miss you, I miss you, baby. Lord knows I do, I miss you, baby. I really miss you. I said I miss you, baby. Lord, I said I miss you, 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 baby. I just can't do without you.
So that brings the libation corner. Let me just do that. So that brings the libation corner to a close for this week. We're going to move now into our analysis of the strategy of Marcus Garvey. We'll see how far we get. We may move beyond repatriation today. I mean, we've got a significant amount of time to work with this evening, so we may cover the repatriation subject in its entirety today. Much will depend on whether people want to ask questions or supplement by ringing in. But for those of you who are actually following in the book, we're now on section 2.5. Grounded Nation Building is the title. A foothold on the land. So grounded nation building, a foothold on the land, and 2.51 is targeted diasporan repatriation to Africa. So that is the section of the book that I'm going to be working from at this time. So let's just go straight into it. The UNIA built an impressive set of national and governmental structures in a short space of time. The embryo of political, diplomatic, economic and military departments was in place and operational within 2 years of the war's end. The war that we're talking about, of course, is the First World War. So within 2 years of the First World War, the UNIA was really a seriously functioning organization. Now, Garvey was building a nation. He understood that a nation without land was a contradiction in terms and set about solving the problem through a program of targeted repatriation. So here we have Garvey's reasoning now. He's building the structures, the kind of bureaucratic structures that are necessary for a government. And we looked last week and the week before, we looked at some of those elements. We looked at how, the conventions operated like a kind of African parliament, UNIA conventions that they had, which made decisions, legislative type decisions, about a way forward for African people. So we saw that kind of those kind of structures. We saw that they had paid structures, even to the point of having an African pope. Archbishop Maguire was the pontiff of the African Orthodox Church. The African Orthodox Church, by the way, was a Christian church, and those members of the UNIA who wanted to, the way that they organised was people who were in their churches were welcome to stay in their churches. People who were in their mosques were welcome to stay in their mosques, and continue their worshipping through what they were familiar with. But anyone who wanted to specifically join the African Orthodox Church, and members, had that option if they chose to, they would then be members of that church at the same time as being members of the UNIA, and would contribute through that organ of the organisation if they so desired. I mention this to show that the extent to which organisation was actually established, with lots of paid offices. So, in effect, Garvey had built up a government and a civil service to carry African matters forward, to carry forward his strategy, or to carry forward the strategy of the UNIA. But then he recognized that, in order to be a nation, it had to have, there had to be land. He saw that the land of US Satan was not going to be an option. African people were outnumbered. They were outnumbered at that point in history by somewhere between 10 to 1 and 5 to 1. Somewhere between those parameters. So there was no possibility that African people were going to gain charge of the soil of US Satan. And anyway, African people wouldn't want to gain charge of it because it wasn't ours anyway. It's the American Indians' land, which was stolen by the European imperialists. And so this is what drives Garvey now to look for an appropriate land. And that appropriate land was Africa, of course. So we are Africans. Africa is the richest land in the world. Obviously, the place for us to build our nation is on our land. Of course, there were problems, because our land was colonized by European imperialists who had carved it up amongst themselves at the Berlin Conference in 1884, 3 years before Garvey himself was actually born. Well, 1884 to 1885, 2 to 3 years before Garvey himself was actually born. So there were problems. But one of the things that he could do, or one of the things that the UNIA could do, is they could begin a process of returning to that land and try to gain a foothold in that land, partly because it's the only land to which we had legitimate claim. Even in the Caribbean, where we constituted a majority, our claim to that land was tenuous at best, because it really was the land of the American Indians, the land of the Arawaks, the Caribs, the Tainos, depending on the labels that we want to actually use. So all of these, all of these circumstances helped to guide Garvey and the UNIA towards looking to Africa as the solution for nationhood. Now, the repatriation program is a targeted repatriation program, and it was targeted in two distinct senses. Firstly, the repatriation efforts would be focused on specific areas in the motherland. That was the first thing. And secondly, those African people most able to help in the building of an African nation would be repatriated in the initial phases of the scheme. Now, it was organised collective. It was organised collective repatriation. I think it's important to understand that. And it was organised collective repatriation for the benefit of all African people the world over, not subject to the whims of individuals seeking personal gain. The objectives were as follows. Firstly, to obtain a secure land base in Africa. Secondly, to fully liberate that land base under a sovereign government. Thirdly, to use the liberated land as a platform from which to drive the colonialists out of Africa. And fourthly, to develop a continental-wide nation-state. So we're seeing some phases here. Yeah. So the first thing was to get a foothold on our soil, and in a moment we'll look at some of the examples where some kind of attempt was actually made. And then once getting a foothold on the soil of Africa, the idea was on one level to build economically, on another level to introduce political structures, and on another level, and when I say political structures, to the beginnings of a state, and on another level, the military level, to prepare effectively for a war of liberation, to get Africa out of the quagmire of colonialism. So reading on, African people in US Satan were, in class and technological terms, the most advanced and highest trained African people in the world. If their learning and skills could be transplanted back into Africa and put into service of African people in general, they could make a considerable contribution to the recovery of Africa and the building of a modern African nation. Garvey was acutely aware of the danger of highly trained African people from the diaspora infected with European elitist ideas, misunderstanding their role by engaging with their home-based sisters and brothers as if they were superior. And he offered some cautions here, and I'm going to quote Garvey in some of the cautions that he offered. He said, "It will not be to go to Africa for the purpose of exercising an overlordship over the natives, but it shall be the purpose of the UNIA to establish in Africa that brotherly cooperation which will make the interests of the African native and the American and West Indian African one and the same. That is to say, we shall enter into a common partnership to build up Africa in the interest of our race." So Garvey was cognizant of the possibility of Africans in the diaspora who will have at that point been more exposed to new technology, been more exposed to Western type education systems. That exposure may have rubbed off on African people in the diaspora in a manner that caused them to think that they were superior to African people at home. Garvey was very cognizant of this problem and made it clear that elitism has no part to play in the relationship between African people at home and African people abroad. That we are all one African people. Garvey was very, very clear on this point. That we are all one people, one African people. We need to come together. We need to work together. We need each other in order to solve the common problem of colonialism that confronted us and that would develop later into neo-colonialism. Now continuing. Connecting the UIA's government structures in waiting and technologically skilled personnel with the soil of Africa was a vital component of the nation-building process. Trained personnel would work cooperatively with locally based African people to directly prepare Africa for its role as a modern nation in the world. This idea was very different from the misrepresentation claiming Garvey sought a total exodus of African people from the Western Hemisphere. Garvey clarified what he meant by repatriation in the following words. So I'm going to share a couple of quotes from Garvey. And these quotes, I hope, will give a sense of what Garvey actually meant when he talked about repatriations, I should say. So in the first quote he says, "Understand this African program well. I am not saying that Africans of US Satan should go to Africa. I'm not saying that all Africans of US Satan should go to Africa. I am not saying that all Africans in the West Indies should go to Africa. But I say this, that some serious attempt must be made to build up a government and a nation strong enough to protect the African, or your future in US Satan will not be worth the snap of a finger. There are many of us here who cannot and will not go back to Africa because of property interests or because of certain conditions, climactic or otherwise. But we are saying that Africa is still your only hope. That without an independent Africa, without a powerful Africa, you are lost." We can see where Malcolm X got his notion from of land being the basis of all power. Malcolm X's mother and father, incidentally, were officers in the UNIA, quite senior officers in the UNIA. Malcolm X himself used to attend UNIA meetings as a boy when his father took him with him to those very same UNIA meetings. So let's be clear that Garvey is not saying that every African person has to go back to Africa. Some people have interpreted Garvey in that way, but that's not clear. We've heard his words, and he's making it very clear that he's not saying that every African must go back. He's actually respecting the fact that some African people will want to stay in places like Britain, will want to stay in places like US Satan, and other parts of the world. It is not necessary for every African person to go home. So Garvey's very clear on that point. But he's also clear on the point that if we do not control our own land, that we can just be lynched at any moment. That one of the reasons why lynching was a pastime of racist Europeans in US Satan was because the African had no home that they controlled, had no power base from which to operate. And so the African situation, we're a bit like a tramp, a homeless tramp, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful to homeless tramps now, yeah? But when you're homeless, you are disempowered. Other people can take advantage of you. Some people do. You know, some people beat up tramps and get some kind of warped kind of pleasure out of it. When you see in London, there's so many homeless people in London now, it's a crying shame. But some people make an occupation out of harassing homeless people, moving them away from the spot that they've chosen to as their sleeping place. So, you know, homeless people might go underneath a bridge and try to sleep under the bridge, because at least then, even if they're not getting protection from the cold, they'll get protection from the rain. And there are people who make it their duty, who make it their pastime, and there are other people who are actually paid to harass them and move them away, so that they can't, they can't have anywhere I was going to say comfortable, but it's not a matter of comfort, actually. In relative terms, it's comfort, but they can't have anywhere, of their own, if you like, for them even to rest their head for the night. So African people that are landless are disempowered in the same way that, a homeless person is disempowered. You can't face the world on an equal footing with others when you're homeless. And our situation is that we're homeless because other people control our land. That's true even till today. Other people are in charge of what happens to the wealth in our soil. We're not actually in charge of it. And so this has a disempowering effect. And so Garvey's plan was that we should go back, take control of our home, be in charge of our home, and then as a result, take our rightful place in the world. And we can see the sense of this. If you look at the Chinese as an example, they control their land. And over the past 50 years or so, they've come from nowhere to being the second or first economic power in the world, depending on which indicators you're looking at. They're either first or second in the world. And that comes out of the Chinese Revolution, which happened in 1949, and the revolution recaptured control of China's land. The Chinese people took control of their own land, and it's taken them time to rebuild, and now, 80 years later now, it's 80 years since the, it's more like 70 years since the Chinese Revolution, and now we see that they are a powerhouse in the world. Incidentally, Chinese land does not have anywhere near the kind of wealth in its soil that African land has in it. Africa's land is by far the richest land in the world. And when we take control of that which is ours, of that land which is ours, we will become the richest and most powerful people in the world. And it will make the Chinese ascension look like a comedy show in comparison. But we must take control of our land. Now, Garvey could see this. And this was part of what underpinned his, or I should say the UNIA's, because he was the leader of the UNIA. This is what underpinned their repatriation strategy. Let me read here a second quote from Garvey, again giving another aspect of what he stood for. He says, and these are Garvey's words now, he says, let me just say this, that I use terms like US Satan. Garvey didn't use the term US Satan. In places you'll hear me use the term African. Garvey sometimes used the term African. He also used a derivative of the N-word, which was current at that time, but you'll hear me use the term African. So there is a little bit of latitude that's going on here, but these are Garvey's words. So the second quote that I have here from Garvey, it says, "It is a mistake to suppose that I want to take the Africans to Africa. I believe that the American Africans have helped to establish North American civilization and therefore have a perfect right to live in US Satan and to aspire to equal opportunities and treatment. Each African can be a citizen of the nation in which he was born or that he has chosen. But I foresee the building of a great state in Africa, which, featuring in concert with the great nations, will make the African race as respectable as others. Cuban Africans will be favored by the building of an African state, because when the state exists, they will be considered and respected as the descendants of this powerful country. which has enough strength to protect them. When you have a strong nation, you can protect your children around the world. Garvey understood this point. And this point manifests in front of our eyes if we look carefully. We see that in US Satan, deaths in custody, police just shoot Africans down in the street. Here in Britain, we are killed at a rate of roughly 1 a week by the police. You know, it's it doesn't make headline news, but a lot of deaths happen. I say by the police, it's more than the police. You have the police on the one hand, you have mental hospitals who are a part of it, you have the prison service, etc., who are a part of it. There are many institutions who between them kill us off at a rate one a week. In US Satan the figure is higher, but there are more of us in US Satan. Now notice that you don't see images of Chinese people being shot by police in US Satan. You don't even hear about Chinese people being killed by police here in Britain. There are lots of reasons for that, but one of those reasons is that they have a powerful government. And if their people die, in an untoward way on the shores of Britain or anywhere else in the world, their government holds the government of that nation to account. They call in the ambassador, and the ambassador has to explain what's going on here. Whereas a divided Africa that hasn't shown great love for its children in the diaspora fails to hold Britain, US Satan and others to account when we are killed in police or other state institution custody. So a strong nation is a protection for us even if we're not there. Now I'm going to move on to just looking at one or two examples. Some of the examples, the repatriation initiatives that were at least attempted by the UNIA. Now section 5.2 in the book it actually looks at those initiatives, and 2.52 I should say, and 2.521 looks at the Ethiopian initiative. Yes, there was a repatriation initiative for Ethiopia going back over 100 years ago. We know that there's a modern manifestation of that in existence to this day. That's Shashamane over in Ethiopia, which Emperor Haile Selassie made available as a land for African people in the diaspora to be able to go to and live as their home, in Ethiopia. So that's a modern day manifestation. But before that happened, there were initiatives which were attempted going back, way back to the 1920s. So here's an example. 3 of the better known repatriation attempts occurred in 1. Ethiopia, 2. What today is called Namibia. In those days it was called Southwest Africa. And 3. Liberia. Now, at the August 1922 UNI convention, the Ethiopian royal family's officially designated agent read out a letter inviting participants to repatriate to Ethiopia. So that's almost 100 years ago that this actual initiative happened. So what you had was the UNIA conventions, which happened in every August. It started in 1920, so 1922 was the third of those conventions. The Ethiopian had governmental representation or diplomatic representation at the UNIA conventions. So they were very serious, occasions, the UNIA conventions. Yeah. And what happened is the Ethiopian government had a letter read out from the floor of the UNIA convention, inviting delegates to come home to Ethiopia, to come and work in Ethiopia, to become part of the building of Ethiopia. Now, there's a contradiction here, because the fact that the invitation was read out at the convention rather than sent via the UNIA structures to be formally presented was a clear snub to the UNIA. And so it betrays that there were some nuances there, some very serious nuances going on in the background. It evidenced the fact that the Ethiopian monarchy did not recognize the UNIA as a potential African government. The initiative therefore failed to receive the support of the UNIA. So what we're seeing now are some of the subtle tensions that were going on in the background. Yes, there were tensions in the background. So on the one hand, you had the Ethiopian royal family. Remember, at that time, Haile Selassie was still a boy. So he was not yet the Emperor Selassie that many people revere today. But nonetheless, the Ethiopian royal family was represented by somebody who attended the UNIA convention. But the problem is this, is that the Ethiopian royal family appoints their own government. So the Ethiopian royal family, with their own government and their own government officials, etc., was not prepared to acknowledge the structures created by the UNIA as governmental structures for Africa. So from the Ethiopian royal family point of view, from Haile Selassie's advisor's point of view, Marcus Garvey is some upstart. How dare he, set up some government, not even in Africa, but set up some government overseas, and then have a plan to come to Africa to make that government the government of Africa, and he hasn't had royal approval. So immediately they were on course for conflict at a class level. So the royal family was obviously the ruling class in that part of Africa. And they were not going to have a set of people who were not even born in the continent come and tell them how to run any part of Africa, presumably, but certainly not their part of Africa. So we can see now the tensions that were going on in the background. And incidentally, those tensions developed very strongly. There was no love lost, actually, between Marcus Garvey and the Emperor Haile Selassie. The Emperor Haile Selassie did not engage in disputes with Marcus Garvey, and this is possibly more to do with royal protocols. But Marcus Garvey did launch some very serious verbal and written attacks against Emperor Haile Selassie, disapproving of some of the decisions, etc., that Emperor Haile Selassie actually made. So the relationship between them was, in the early phases, reasonably good. But it deteriorated between the 1920s and the 1930s. It deteriorated considerably, and between 1935 and 1940, it hit absolute rock bottom. Now, continuing. Even though the Ethiopian proposal turned out to be a non-starter in organizational terms, a handful of individuals took up the offer. These individual initiatives were not supported by the UNIA amidst suggestions that it was too far away, and that is that Ethiopia was too far away. But this was a cover story designed to conceal the poor diplomatic relations between the UNIA and Ethiopia's royal family. Although a few individuals went, the Ethiopian initiative never really got off the ground. It reached its lowest ebb when, and I'm going to quote Amy Jakes Garvey here, the second wife of Marcus Garvey. She explains this quote, I think, explains the circumstance. She says, persons desirous of going had to get the Abyssinian Consul General to get a job for them with the government, especially in schools, or satisfy him and his government that the immigrants' financial ability to set himself up in business. And she continues, they also had to declare that they were not connected to the Garvey movement. In other words, Ethiopia did not want the UNIA on their soil. They did not want what was called the Garvey movement on their soil. And this was a manifestation of the contradiction that existed between the kind of peoples-based approach of Marcus Garvey and the UNIA and the elitist royalist approach of the royal family of Ethiopia. So let's move on. Let's briefly look at the Namibian initiative. Now, in those days, Namibia was called Southwest Africa. Now, the Namibian idea emerged in the aftermath of World War I and was actively pursued in September 1922 via the League of Nations. Now, let me just explain that the League of Nations is the forerunner to the United Nations. So before the United Nations was called the United Nations, it was called the League of Nations. And what happened was the UNIA petitioned the League of Nations. Now, Germany had been defeated, and the so-called Allied nations had confiscated her colonies, i.e., stolen land from Germany which Germany had stolen from African people. Now, Garvey saw that African people had a legitimate claim to setting up a government there and outlined African people's moral case. Now, here's a quote from Garvey illustrating what he saw as the rightful claim of African people. And Garvey says this. He says, at Versailles, when the peace treaty was to be signed, you called everybody in and you distributed the spoils of war to everybody. You gave the Jew Palestine. You gave the Egyptians a larger modicum of self-government. You gave the Irish home rule and dominion status. You gave the Poles a new government of their own. But what did you give the African? What did you do to the African? You threw his dead body on the streets of Cardiff, smashed the coffin and kicked the corpse about as though it was a football. And this was his reward after he came back from war. Now, there are a few things in Garvey's quote here, and I think we've got to contextualize this a little bit. Now, World War One, according to the way that the Europeans write the history, was won by what they call the Allied forces, and in particular, they talk in terms of Britain. The losing side was clearly Germany. Now, what happened, and Garvey mentions the Versailles Peace Conference. In 1919, there was a Versailles Peace Conference. In fact, it went from 1919 right the way through to 1920. It was a year-long conference, and the purpose of that conference was to decide, if you like, the new world order. Yeah, so they were deciding how to order the world, and they were, basically the victors of the war were stealing from those that lost the war. That's called reparations, and so they were just taking what they wanted. Now, Garvey mentions that many groups were given, extra power at that time. He mentions the Irish, he mentions the Poles, he mentions Palestine, etc., etc., etc. So he mentions these different groups of people. The problem is they didn't recognize African people as people. Their racism was so deeply embedded that there was going to be nothing from for African people. Now, one of the contradictions now is that Germany, as part of its punishment for losing World War I, was stripped of its African colonies. Germany had Togo next door to Ghana. Togo was a German colony. It had Tanganyika, what today is called Tanzania. Tanganyika, what today is called Tanzania, was a German colony. The Cameroon was a German colony. What then was called Southwest Africa, today it's called Namibia, that was a German colony. Now, around Rwanda and Burundi, those were German. That area was a German colony. So Germany had these territories in Africa, and as a result of losing the war, it was stripped of its African territories. Because remember, Africa is the richest land in the world. So the biggest punishment that you could give Germany was taking away the wealth of the soil of Africa that it had stolen from African people. Yeah? So those territories were taken away. You see that Togo was split up between the British and the French. The Cameroon was split up between the British and the French. Tanganyika, what today's Tanzania, was taken over by the British. The British just took the whole lot. And Southwest Africa, what today's called Namibia, was actually, in the end, given over to the custody of the fascists in South Africa. So what you had was a situation where South Africa had a kind of dominant controlling interest. They were not officially allowed to colonize, but they had a dominating interest. They had a governmental kind, arm's length interest in Namibia, and effectively kept an eye on Namibia on behalf of Britain. There's a character by the name of Jan Smuts. I won't go into that history, but he was one of the military people South African military. I'm talking about racist apartheid South Africa, although no, technically apartheid did not come into existence until the 1940s, but the racism was in existence, and the ill treatment of African people was in existence even before the label apartheid came into existence, and he was a part of that, and he was the leading military man operating on Britain's behalf, even though he was a South African national, operating on Britain's behalf in that part of the world. And so under his tutelage, if you like, they had a hand in Namibia. Namibia is a very rich place, of course. They could go there and steal all kinds of gold, diamonds, all kinds of things there for them to steal. So, in a sense, Britain formally had, in a formal sense, had control of Tanzania, what today's Tanzania, and in an indirect sense, had control of what today is Namibia. Now, coming back now to the UNIA, the UNIA's plan was, look, you're giving out wealth and land and rights to all these people, the Palestinians, the Irish, the Egyptians, you name it, you're giving it to all of them. Yeah. Well, what we want as part of our plan for repatriation, what we want is Namibia. And then we'll make Namibia our base, and we will use that as our location for, repatriating back to Africa. So that was Garvey's plan. Now, incidentally, W.E.B. Du Bois, the Niagara movement, etc., they also had a plan. And their plan did not involve repatriation. W.E.B. Du Bois, just to take a step back now, when he was a student, W.E.B. Du Bois was a very, very light-skinned African. That's the first thing to understand. Very, very light-skinned African. In some respects, indistinguishable from a European. So he looked very much like a European, or maybe a Southern European with a bit of a tan. Yeah, and W.E.B. Du Bois, he was the first African to graduate from Harvard University, for instance. Yeah, so he kind of in some way slipped across the colour line. Yeah, even though he said the 20th century would be the century of the colour line, in many respects he slipped across the colour line. One of the examples of that was he was a student in Berlin in the 1890s. Now this is very important, yeah, because in 1884, 1885 you had the Berlin Conference, which is where the European imperialist nations carved up Africa and shared it out amongst themselves. Now, within a few years of that, he was actually a student there, and so he was able to get a full sense of the magnitude of the racism. And in his presence, because he looked like a European, many of them would have had their guards down. So they would have just spoken it as it is, many of them even thinking that he is a European. It may not have occurred to some of them that he was actually an African. And so he was able to get an insight into their thinking. Now, a central tenet in the thinking of Germany, and the whole reason for the Berlin Conference, was for them to get their clutches on the Congo. They wanted Central Africa. Central Africa is the richest part of the richest continent in the world, and Germany wanted to get Central Africa under its control. They were not allowed to get it in Berlin. That's why they ended up having the Burundi, Rwanda kind of area just on the edge of the Congo, and also Tanganyika, links into the Congo. But they were not allowed to have the Congo. It was just too rich to allow them to have it, and that's how this character Leopold of Belgium managed to get it as a custodian, and nothing more than a custodian. But anyway, coming back, so the plan of the Germans was to co-opt and take control of Central Africa, which would make them the most powerful nation in the world. The others wouldn't allow it. So what Dubois, who was aware of this plan, did is he put forward a proposal for what he called the natives to have control of the Congo. So his plan wasn't a repatriation plan. He was simply saying, well, give the natives control of the Congo. And that was his way of kind of, he was reinterpreting the German plan that he had been exposed to whilst he was a student in Berlin. But Garvey's plan was to go to Namibia and set up there part one of his repatriation strategy, and to build government structures there, and to use that as a launch pad for taking over the whole continent on behalf of the rightful owners, African people. Now, again, some more information, background information. Whilst the Versailles, remember Garvey talks about at the Versailles Peace Conference, yeah? The first Pan-African Congress takes place at the same time as the Versailles Peace Conference. Not the entirety of it. The Versailles Peace Conference lasted for a year. But within a month of the beginning of the Versailles Peace Conference, you have the first Pan-African Congress organized by W.E.B. Du Bois in Paris, in the same place, Versailles, basically, because African people were trying to get their voices heard. Remember, they didn't treat us as though we were human beings. So we were not allowed to be a part of the Versailles Peace Conference. But African people who had just come back from the war, who had, fought and died in many cases, were courageous enough now to say, we're coming whether you're going to let us come in or not. And so what they did is they went to petition the Versailles Peace Conference, and just in case they were not going to be allowed in, they had their own conference, which was called the First Pan-African Congress. In fact, they were not allowed to participate. The racist US Satan and racist Britain actually stipulated as part of the rules that they were not allowed to participate when they got wind of the fact that Africans were coming over. They actually stipulated they were not allowed to enter, and so the first Pan-African Congress, organised by W. Du Bois, then takes on the mantle of being a bit of a kind of a sideshow, if you like. It was a bit of a sideshow to the main event, which was the Versailles Conference, where the lands, etc., were going to be allocated. Now, at the Versailles Peace Conference, the UNIA is represented as well. Is not represented in the conference, but they send a delegate, or they send delegates there. One of the delegates that they send is a man called A. Philip Randolph. So he is I believe, the head of the UNIA delegation that goes to try to petition the Versailles Peace Conference. But that petitioning was not successful if we measure success by the standard of them being allowed to actually address the conference, make a statement in the conference demanding the land in Africa that they wanted. So that's a little bit more of the background to what was going on there at the time. As we continue, and I'm going back to there was one other thing. It was the fact that the soldiers had returned, African soldiers had returned and were not prepared to put up with the racism of Europeans. Now, you've got to understand that African people, up until 1900, say, there was this illusion that Europeans were kind of invincible. It's almost as though there's nothing you could do to kill them. When Africans were co-opted into the war, one of the things they saw was just how easy it was for Europeans to die. They got hit by bullets, they died. they got hit by shrapnel, they died. They just died like anyone else. They were not next to God. They didn't have superhuman powers. They just simply died. And Africans actually saw this for themselves. And so when soldiers came back from World War One, they were not prepared to put up with the racist rubbish of Europeans. And they were prepared to stand up and fight, if need be, against these racist Europeans. Now, one of the things that happened is when one of the returning soldiers was attacked by a mob in Cardiff, a European mob in Cardiff, he fought back. And that mob, outnumbered him and killed him. And then they invaded. They literally, when his funeral was happening, they literally, invaded his funeral, smashed up his coffin, and then kicked his body around the streets of Cardiff, treating his body literally like a football. This is the extent of the barbarism of these people. The extent, it's difficult to imagine that caliber of disdain. It's difficult to imagine that people could actually do that, but that is an historical fact. That's actually what happened. And so Garvey is reminding them as part of the petition. He's reminding them that you've given everybody else something. Not only have you not given the African anything, you've given the African the most malicious, wicked, sadistic ill treatment you can think of. Kicking our dead bodies around the street as though we're footballs. But coming back now to the text. Furthermore, it was actually African soldiers who had won the critical battles leading to the regaining of African land. Land that was now to be parcelled off to Britain and France, as I've just explained. The UNIA set about ensuring that the claims of African people were represented at the League of Nations convention. The area in which this further injustice against African people was to be ratified. So, what happens, before I read on, what happens is you have the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919, but the whole process is to be ratified by the League of Nations in 1922. And by this time, African people have organised themselves with much more effect. And the UNIA is present at the League of Nations. W.E. Du Bois, his Niagara movement, etc., they're present at the 1922 League of Nations deliberations, and the UNIA actually works out a way to get to speak. So they've worked out strategies. Our ancestors were not playing. They worked out strategies to get to speak or to have their voice heard in that conference. And one of the ways that it happened was Ethiopia was present as a nation. Ethiopia shared an ambassador with what today would be Iran and Iraq in particular. It was the Ottoman, the Ottoman, or the remnants of the Ottoman Empire. So if you can imagine Iran and Iraq basically as one nation, bits of Turkey would have been in that as well. So it was literally the remnants of the Ottoman Empire, but mainly we're talking about what today would be called Iran and Iraq. Iran and Iraq had its ambassador at the League of Nations. It shared its ambassador with Ethiopia. So the UNIA liaised with Ethiopia to persuade Ethiopia to allow its ambassador to speak for the UNIA at the League of Nations. So, in fact, it liaised with Ethiopia and it liaised with the Iran-Iraq combination. And an agreement was struck, and the Arabic ambassador then read a message prepared by the UNIA at the League of Nations, making the demand for for Africans to have Namibia as their homeland. Now, let me read a little something from that. Yeah. So here is part of what was read out at that conference. It says, in keeping with the 14th article of the petition, Your Excellencies are hereby informed that a delegation from the 3rd Annual International Convention of the African People of the World will wait upon the Assembly during its entire session from 4th of September to be available for personally presenting the claims of the African race, to answer all questions that may be submitted by the League. It is felt that the delegation will be given consideration merited because of the importance of the representation. Your Excellencies are hereby informed that the 3rd Annual International Convention of African Peoples of the World is a duly elected body representing the interests of 400 million African people of the world, and that the accompanying petition is an expression of the feelings of the African race. So this was or part of what was put to the League of Nations, read out as it was by the Arabic ambassador to Iran, Iraq, and Ethiopia. So we see here that the UNIA was cooperating with non-Africans in order to get its voice heard. This was part of the kind of alliance and solidarity work that the UNIA was actually involved in. Now, the UNIA delegation was prevented from addressing the League of Nations on the grounds that it did not have the status of a nation. However, Persia, that is modern Iran and Iraq, I'm reading for the book now, was represented at the 1922 UNIA Convention by Council General H. Topayakan. Let me make sure I got that. Topakyan. Yeah, that's the correct pronunciation. Topakyan was his name. So he was Council General H. Topakyan. There was a healthy alliance between the UNIA and Persia, which had the appropriate status and put forward the petition on its behalf. Through this cooperative act, the UNIA's alliance with Arabs gave it a voice in an international arena that it would otherwise not have had. Needless to say, the imperialists were never going to give African land over to African people, and certainly not voluntarily to the UNIA. So, we were making strenuous attempts to be heard. We were petitioning them, trying to talk sense to imperialism, in the hope that they would actually, allow us, if I can use that kind of language, to have access to our own land. But of course, we are dealing with an intense racism and a realization on their part that if they gave us land, or if we managed to procure and recapture our land in any sense, we would be on the road to recovery, and they were not going to allow us to recover. I mean, how could they? if they allow African people to recover, it's the end of the game as far as imperialism is concerned. So it's important to understand that the UNIA, not just the UNIA, but the UNIA was one of the leading African organizations seeking to re-establish us with a land base in our motherland in order to bring back our dignity, our pride, and our economic prowess, actually, in the world. Now, what I think I'll do now. Let's just do a brief musical interlude, and I'll come back a little after this. We need to remember.
That the revolution has begun. The revolution is right. Live for
Be right, G. Enitobansu.
This is the immensely talented group known as African Revolution.
Revolution, African revolution, revolution. Come we go, 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 come we go. I want my freedom. I want it now. I want my freedom. I want it now. Right now. This one is for Marcus. This one is for Malcolm X. This one is for Haiti. I'm calling the ancestors, yeah. African revolution. That's what we're talking about. This year African revolution, yeah. That's what we're talking about. So come along, say African revolution, African revolution, African revolution, African revolution, revolution, African revolution, revolution.
That was African Revolution, an immensely talented group of musicians with the African drum, the djembe, forming a central plinth. It allows me also to remember a member of that group that has transitioned, our elder, Baba Ade Soso Wallace, we certainly remember the tremendous contribution, positive contribution that he made to our lives. So, as we continue now, there was the third initiative, repatriation initiative, and that was the Liberian initiative. And I'll just continue from the book here. Now, the UNIA made its main repatriation effort in Liberia, where it had been making efforts for a number of years. Its reasoning was summed up as follows. The people who live in Liberia today are blood of our blood. This is Garvey speaking, by the way. Yeah? The people who live in Liberia today are blood of our blood, flesh of our flesh, especially the ruling element, the Americo-West Indian Liberians. They represent in Liberia today the offspring of an earlier generation of African people who went from this country to the West Indies 100 years ago, 80 years ago, 50 years ago, 1/4 of a century ago, to make it possible to find and have freedom. A freedom that would indeed be worthwhile not only for themselves, but for the rest of their kind. Now, so Garvey is alluding to the very important connection between the people of Liberia, not just Liberia actually, it's Sierra Leone as well, but the initiative was with Liberia, where people who had been, African people who had been enslaved in the Western Hemisphere were repatriated in many instances back to Sierra Leone or Liberia. Now, if you were an African enslaved in US Satan, there was something called the American Repatriation Society, which was racist Europeans trying to get rid of Africans. They would actually assist you to repatriate back to Africa, and many African people, particularly towards the end of the enslavement era, repatriated and went back as part of that initiative. So, Liberia, the capital of Liberia is Monrovia, and the reason it's named Monrovia is because it's named after the US Satan president at the time, Monroe, who basically facilitated, allowed finances and ships and resources, etc., to be used to ship some African people back to West Africa. Now, at the same time this was happening, just to contextualize it a little bit further, in Sierra Leone, you had Africans who were shipped back mainly from the Caribbean now. To some extent, South America as well. Africans were shipped back. These are the Creole people who were shipped back. So among those would be the Jamaican Maroons, for instance. The Jamaican Maroons from the Second Maroon War in the late 1790s, 1795 to 1796. The Maroons, who were never ever defeated, part of the treaty that was signed, they went first to Nova Scotia in Canada. So they were in Canada, and they just found it was just too inhospitable. It was just freezing cold, basically. And so, they demanded that they be sent back to Africa, and they were returned to Sierra Leone. Also in St. Vincent and St. Lucia, you had two sets of Maroons. In St. Vincent, the term Maroon is used, but in St. Lucia, the term brigand is used. Maroon, or Mawan, means to run away. And in St. Lucia, the Africans said, we're not running away, we're brigands, we're warriors, we're soldiers. And so they refused to use the name Maroon and described themselves as brigands. So the brigands and the Maroons of St. Vincent and St. Lucia, who were never defeated, never defeated. As part of the contracts that they signed, some of them also went to Sierra Leone, and there are other examples around the Caribbean and some parts of South America of African people being sent back to Sierra Leone and Liberia. Now, because of that particular history, what you had were African people on the motherland who actually had lived in the Caribbean or had lived in the Americas. Yeah, and it just so happened that the leader of Liberia, his surname was King. Yeah, the leader of Liberia, it just so happened that his father was born in Jamaica. And so Marcus Garvey, was born in Jamaica. The president of Liberia, his father was born in Jamaica. They had some common ground, so they could break bread, they could speak, and so there was considerable correspondence between them. And because of that common Caribbean connection, they were able to develop a plan for repatriation. And so this is the section that I'm reading now. So the determination of the UNIA to make a success of the scheme was boldly expressed, and I quote, and this is Garvey, of course: "We are asking the world for a fair chance. That is all we're asking for. We are asking the world for a fair chance to assist the people of Liberia in developing that country, as the world is giving the Jew a fair chance to develop Palestine. And if they do not give us a fair chance, we are going to raise hell." These are Garvey's words. Yeah. So a delegation was dispatched in late 1923 to consolidate links and survey relevant prospective areas for the repatriation project. In 1924, the government of Liberia officially and graciously accepted the idea of being the base for repatriation of its sisters and brothers overseas, and it did so with open arms. Now, Garvey and the UNI had finally found a place on African soil. The nation-building program was no longer just talk. It had a material base. It had a land base. So it now had real roots. So at this point, repatriation is not just some kind of airy-fairy thing. It's a real project. So Garvey had previously given the indication of the scale of the project that the UNIA had in mind. So just to get a sense of what Garvey was thinking about when he talked in terms of repatriation, here's another quote from Garvey. Garvey says, "Between January the 1st and 31st, and December 31st of 1921, it is expected that the UNIA and the Black Star Line will have transported between 500,000 and 1 million civilized, industrious Africans from the Western Hemisphere to the Great Republic of Liberia." Let's get a sense of that plan now. Yeah. The UNIA was not some joke business. The UNIA was our Navy. It was our transport. It transported personnel, and it also transported resources. So the UNIA was an integral part of the repatriation program. Sometimes people forget that. They think it's just a kind of show business type thing. It had real work to do. And the UNIA or the Black Star Line was going to transport up to 1 million African people from the Western Hemisphere to Africa in 1 year. Think about that. This was the scale of the plan that Garvey had. It was going to transport not just people, it was going to transport resources. It was going to transport equipment. They were, they were going to industrialize. You must understand that UNIA had factories in US Satan. And those were just kind of preparation projects so that you understand how to manage and build factories and, how to produce. So this was like the homework that they were doing, but they were going to put that properly into practice in Africa. Now, the significance of this is very important because some of you will remember something which is called Black Wall Street. And in Black Wall Street, African people had come together and they'd created, economic enterprise which was so successful that it outstripped what Europeans were actually doing. And the Europeans got so jealous that they bombed it. They flew helicopters over the top, they dropped bombs on it, they killed Africans in massive numbers. So what Garvey was doing is he was saying, look, it's not safe even to do these kinds of projects in US Satan, which is what the Black Wall Street proves. So Garvey was going to do that in Africa, where there would be enough of us to actually protect it. And remember, he was bringing over soldiers. He was bringing over World War I veterans. Those World War I veterans were training other African people who had not been in the war so that we would have a military capable of protecting whatever was going to be built by us in Liberia. So this was a massive project that the UNIA had in mind. But reading on, suddenly 2 months later, Liberia withdrew the agreement, blocking all UNIA shipments to its ports with no explanation. The rug had been pulled from under the agreement, and to make matters worse, the land which had formed the basis of the agreement was now leased to the Firestone Rubber Company for 99 years. Can you imagine that? So this whole plan had happened, and the process had actually begun, and lots of equipment was now in Liberia. And what King does, this is the president of Liberia, is he confiscates, he steals all the stuff that UNIA have brought over, and then he says, right, okay, we're cancelling this plan, and he won't even talk to the UNIA at this point. So there are funny things going on in the background. Now, some of what we know that went on in the background, it's not. You see, it was all kind of cloak and dagger, underhanded, etc. So we don't know everything that happened, but we do know that there were very intense and bitter struggles going on between the W.E.B. Du Bois branch of Pan-Africanism and the Marcus Garvey branch of Pan-Africanism. So you had the Pan-African Congress, which I mentioned. There was one in 1919, another one in 1921, 23, and so on. But you also had the UNIA conventions, 1920, 1921, 1922, and then 1924. You had the UNIA conventions. Now, the UNIA conventions were massive events with thousands of people. And we're talking about 25,000 people at the 1921 convention, for instance. The Pan-African Congresses were much smaller affairs with, maybe 100 or a couple of hundred people. So in terms of scale, there was just no comparison between the two of them. The UNIA were the mass events. Now, there was competition between the two. There were jealousies. There were name calling. There were all kinds of unsavory goings on between the two branches. Dubois, for instance, cursing Garvey for his blackness. Remember, Dubois is a very light-skinned African, almost looking like a European. And so he's cursing Garvey, calling him a black fat man, and all these kinds of these kinds of labels. So it became very quite acrimonious. Now, one of the things that happened was Dubois becomes part of a delegation which is sent by US Satan to the president, King, the president of Liberia. And as far as we can tell, we don't know the details, they persuaded King to pull out of that deal. That's what seems to have happened. And the Firestone part of it seems to be that they promised that the land, they would get more money out of Firestone than they would have received out of the UNIA. So they used one of their transnationals. And Firestone turned that land into a rubber plantation and used it to make tires. So the land which was supposed to be ours was used to make tires. Now, I haven't followed up. 99 years, we're in 2020 now. That lease, if we're going back to 1924 roughly, that lease should be coming to an end now. It should be somewhere around about at its end in 2023, maybe even 2022, depending on which point in the year. So I'm not sure how that arrangement is panning out in the modern day. Of course, I don't expect for one moment that the Europeans will stick to the agreement that was actually made. I'm sure they've made without actually having researched it, I'm sure that they've made arrangements to keep hold of our land even after the lease has run out. But it would be interesting actually to find out what is the situation with that lease currently. Maybe that's a piece of research when I have a bit of time I will be able to do. Now, continuing. There was a hidden hand blocking the progress of the UNIA. Every attempt to repatriate in an organised, systematic, targeted manner had been thwarted. This was the most important single factor undermining the liberation and nation-building strategy. It was a body blow to Garvey and the UNIA. No land meant no base. No base meant no sovereign territory. No sovereign territory meant no platform from which to drive out the colonialists. No colonialists meant no colonialist expulsions meant no continental nation state. The remainder of the liberation and nation-building strategy simply could not be carried through. Garvey had the entire vision, but was blocked from advancing any further. Nation-building without land is a contradiction in terms. The fact that every inch of African land was under the political control of Africa's imperialist enemy was an obvious blockage to the building of an African nation. Garvey was under no illusions. He knew that the recovery of African land by its legitimate owners could not be achieved by diplomatic efforts alone. Now, let me just take a look. That brings. I'm going to leave it there with the repatriation side of things today. In the remaining few minutes, I suppose I could go on to look at another aspect of Garvey. This next aspect is a very important aspect, and I may start it. Many people don't know Garvey's words on armed struggle. his words on armed struggle have been buried, and they were buried for tactical reasons. Garvey was was put in prison on trumped-up charges. He was accused of mail fraud. They made up whatever it is they made up. There was no victim to the charge that he was convicted of. They couldn't find out one single victim, but they managed to put him in prison for it anyway. Now, whilst he was in prison, the most famous book connected with Garvey, The Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, it was written and released. Now, he didn't write it. His wife wrote it. His second wife, Amy Jakes Garvey, wrote it. She was an outstanding journalist in her own right. And she was the one who took the responsibility under guidance from Garvey, who was in prison, who took the responsibility of compiling the Philosophies and Opinion, Book 1 and Book 2. You get them together now. It's one book now, but there was Book 1 and Book 2 of the Philosophies and Opinions of Marcus Garvey in the original form. Now, we've got to understand that Amy Jakes Garvey was a wife whose husband was in prison. And so she wanted to get her husband out of prison. That was what she wanted to achieve. That was obviously of critical importance to her. And so when she compiled the Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, remember she had the she had the editorial role. She left out Garvey's words on armed struggle. She left out Garvey's words on fighting to the death. She left out his most militant language, because she understood that if these words were released as part of that, it would have been those books in those days. It wasn't one book; it was two. Those books. If it was released as part of those books, that the state authorities would read it, and the chances of her getting her husband out of prison would be, well, if not reduced, possibly next to nil. And so she left out his most militant wording. One of the things that that this book does, that is Pan-Africanism from Program to Philosophy, it revives some of those words of Garvey. There are some quotes in here which will help us to understand Garvey's militant side in a way that has been kind of not lost. I won't describe it as lost. It is possible to find the words if people are prepared to research, but it's not an easy task. You have to work quite hard to find Garvey's words on armed struggle. Now, I'll start that process now, but I'll come back to it next week. Before going into that, actually, let me just do a little bit of a musical interlude, and then I'll start the process.
Drum beats, giant footsteps. Drum beats, giant footsteps.
Drum beats. More from the immensely talented African Revolution.
Drum beats, giant footsteps. Drum beats, giant footsteps. Drum beats.
A giant footstep from Mother Earth of Father Time. Moving on and we still can't leave the past behind. Bars and rhymes painting pictures like art design. Hearts and minds where answers lie, they ain't hard to find. Let the horn line harmonize. Spark the vibe, let us all rise. Mark the sky rather high. Touche, let the true way grace us. True say it's a new day, wake up back with a vengeance. Vibrating fractions and segments, stamping the entrance. Mind shaking like a thunderbolt. Styles is comfortable with the trumpet call sounding wonderful. See we unwind over the drum line. We really shine bright golden like sunlight. Bless the infants, watch the kids cleanse the air like an incense, clearing the distance.
Feel the vibe, brother, sister, when my palm touch base. Breathe a life, yet another pass, yeah, it's a way to free up what's inside, legs and arms, can't wait. Said it's been a long time, done survive the hard days, think can only get better. More the wiser, someone in the mix to get cheddar. We're here for all weather, still intact, they thought they see us in tethers. Keep this up in check, we came to step the lever.
Drum beats and giant footsteps, hear the sound of the trumpet call. It's a new day, a new day, elephant walk. Drum beats and giant footsteps, hear the sound of the trumpet call. It's a new day, elephant walk.
Let the djembe cure like medicine. Come with us, yeah, walk with the elephants. Any problems, all of us settle it. Lick rhythms, clap hands, anything. The sun shines when the sky smiles and gets moody when you see dark clouds. Hear the trumpet call, run faster. Gather round, hear stories, laughter. Together vibes we bring. If you can talk, you can sing. If you can walk, you can dance. We say the same old thing, but in different content. New day, leave out the nonsense. New thoughts, new ways to get yourself up out of the maze and progress. Don't waste time on protests. Watch for information they process.
Drum beats and giant footsteps, hear the sound of the trumpet call. It's a new day, elephant walk. Drum beats and giant footsteps, hear the sound of the trumpet call. It's a new day, elephant walk. Drum beats and giant footsteps, hear the sound of the trumpet call. It's a new day, elephant walk. Drum beats and giant footsteps, hear the sound of the trumpet call. It's a new day, elephant walk.
So that was African Revolution, an immensely talented group featuring on the rapping side of things there. That was our brother Watusi. Yes, let me just begin to make a start on the on Marcus Garvey and his words on bloodshed, or his words on armed struggle. And this section here is entitled Bloodshed for the Birth of the African Nation. Now, European imperialists were not prepared to give up even an inch of Africa. And, you know, they weren't prepared to give it up to each other without a fight. And that's evidenced by World War I. It follows that there was no prospect whatsoever of them returning the land that they had stolen to its rightful owners. In other words, returning it to us, African people. Now, Garvey was fully aware that the reclaiming of African land would involve nothing less than a fight to the death with Africa's imperialist enemies. So, for instance, and here I'm going to introduce some quotes from Garvey. Consider this first quote. Garvey says, "Of course we'll have to kick the Europeans out of Africa. You would like to know by what means we are going to carry out this task. Allow me not to speak, for I would let out a secret of this organization." So here we have Garvey giving a hint of the preparedness of the UNIA for armed struggle, but not actually saying that he's going to engage in armed struggle. Here's another quote from Garvey. Garvey says, "You will realize that liberty and democracy are very expensive things, and you have to give life for it. And if we Africans think we can get all these things without shedding blood for them, we are making a dreadful mistake. You are not going to get anything unless you organize to fight for it. There are some things you can fight for constitutionally, such as your political rights, your civil rights. But to get liberty, you have to shed blood for it. And that is what the UNIA is preparing your minds for, to shed some blood, so as to make your race a free and independent race. That blood we are not going to shed in Newport News. That blood we are not going to shed in US Satan, because US Satan will not be big enough to hold the African when the African gets ready. That blood we are preparing to shed one day on the African battlefield, because it is the determination of the new African to repossess himself of that country that God gave his forefathers. Africa, the richest continent in the world, is the country that has given civilization to mankind and has made the white man what he is today. You see, that's serious fighting talk coming from Garvey. Garvey is making it clear that there is no bloodless route to the liberation of African people, that the European imperialists are not going to give up our land without a fight. And so that means that we are going to have to fight and fight to the death in order to retrieve it. This kind of language doesn't appear in Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey. It doesn't appear generally in the books you read about Garvey. Maybe it's because somebody's trying to conceal it. Now, in this next section, supplying weapons to the needy, it reads, Garvey was not an advocate. Garvey was not advocating that the UNIA should return to Africa in an attempt to liberate it over and above the heads of its sisters and brothers in the motherland. It was his position that the UNIA should arm its sisters and brothers as part of a program of driving the colonialist enemy out of Africa. As he put it, and I'm going to quote Garvey again here, it's important to quote Garvey, so that we know what Garvey actually said. Yeah, he says, African people in Kenya stopped all public vehicles and told those white robbers riding in them to get out and walk. Now that shows some new spirit. Anyhow, stopped every buggy, stopped every carriage that went by and told the occupants to get out and walk. That shows that they're coming, doesn't it? The only handicap they had was that they had sticks and stones. Now it is for you, men and women, who are mixed up with modern civilization for 300 years, to give them something else besides sticks and stones. You have to give them the latest output of science. I won't tell you what that is. It means that you and I must get busy, because all the Africans now have are sticks and stones, and they cannot do anything with such weapons as a means of defense. Marcus Garvey's words. There is little doubt that US Satan authorities treated Garvey's words seriously. It invested considerable resources into spying on the UNIA with the aim of unearthing more. So for instance, and this now, I'm reading now from a secret, what was at the time a secret report, it's now declassified papers of the Bureau of Investigation. Let me just explain. You've got today what's called the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. The precursor to the CIA is the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Now, the Federal Bureau of Investigation started off as the US Satan spying institution inside US Satan. And when it became more sophisticated and it wanted to spy outside US Satan, it created the CIA, originally as a branch of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but then as a spying entity in its own right, perhaps in fact now even more powerful than the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So going backwards, you had the CIA, and then you had the FBI at the origin of the CIA. Well, when you go to the origin of the FBI, you come to something called the BI, the Bureau of Investigation. And the Bureau of Investigation over time develops into the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And now I'm reading from an extract from the classified papers or declassified papers of the Bureau of Investigation, which was what it was called back then in the 1920s. And it says, one of the principal informers on Negro subversion, this is their language, for the Military Intelligence Division, alleged that Garvey and the Friends of Irish Freedom were linked. The Military Intelligence Division disclosed in its confidential weekly situation survey of the 23rd of June 1920 that its informer, R.D. Jonas, we've got his name, had publicly declared that the Friends of Irish Freedom had aided in establishing the Black Star, in brackets, Negro shipping line, which would ultimately carry arms to Africa. So the secret intelligence agencies had, they allege, uncovered a plan to smuggle arms to Africa. That plan was going to be assisted by the Irish dockers. Garvey had an alliance with what today would be called the IRA. It would have been the Sinn Féin wing that he would have had the dealings with. And the Irish dockers were going to secretly load weapons onto the Black Star shipping line. Those weapons were going to go over to Africa to be stockpiled in Liberia, awaiting use. Remember, Garvey was talking about he was going to send over something like 1 million African people in 1 year. So you can imagine that the plan would have been to send over, maybe hundreds of thousands of guns in order to properly equip the soldiers that were going to be sent over. This reveals some of the hidden plans of the UNIA. Now, I'm delighted to say that our brother Astamari is here with us today. Brother, it's a to see you again in the studio, and our brother will be with you very shortly. So he's coming up, anytime soon. Anytime soon. Yeah. So I will be bringing the program to a close for this evening. it really just remains for me to, if you just bear with me. So we're gonna bring the program to a close for this evening. It really just remains now for me to say some thank yous. I want to say a big thank you to everybody that listened to the program this evening. I want to say a big thank you to my fellow presenters here on Bless Radio, including, of course, my brother Astamari, who will be joining me in the next couple of minutes. I want to say thank you to the engineers who have supervised and looked after the equipment during the program. I want to say thank you to the station's management for the tremendous work that they do in the background to ensure that this facility is available to us as a people. But most of all, I want to say thank you to our ancestors, without whom none of us would be here today. My name is Brother Omowale. I wish you or bid you a good evening and look forward to your company between 8 p.m. and 10 p.m. next month. Love and respect to you all.